Pod Save the World is brought to you by Tommy John.
Oh, cool.
Spring is in the air.
It is.
Fall games, barbecues, and oh yeah, spring cleaning. Change things up this year and treat yourself by throwing out those old multi-pack boxers and replacing them with the unbelievable comfort of Tommy John.
You know how there's been a bunch of conservatives who have for no reason at all decided to risk their entire livelihoods and reputations by attacking children because they have a different opinion on gun control? Yeah. I've thought that we could refer to it as a spring teening. The way that these teens have cleaned out these conservatives.
That's really good.
The spring teening.
Tommy John is committed to providing unparalleled comfort, not only in their undergarments, but in all of their incredible apparel.
I'm going to tweet that.
Tommy John is a revolutionary clothing company for the modern man, and they make the greatest underwear on the planet. Intuitive designs combined with smart fabrics to eliminate bunching, squishing, riding up all together. In other words, they're wedgie proof. Tommy John is fantastic, guys. They're comfortable. Don't sleep on the quick draw fly. You're not going to want to go back to the other kind of flies, whatever those are branded. I'm not saying the word nestled in that context, but you're going to like the undies. Tommy John also...
Quick draw fly.
They also reimagined t-shirts with their silky soft second skin tees. They have vibrant colors, a modern fit, and premium fabrics that make the second skin tees a must-have. Plus, they are wrinkle resistant and they never shrink. Hurry to TommyJohn.com/world for 20% off your first order. That's TommyJohn.com/world for 20% off the most comfortable clothing items imaginable. What is that?
It's always the good, the bad, and the ugly for the quick draw fly. Quick draw.
TommyJohn.com/world. Welcome back to Pod Save the World. This is Tommy Vietor. I learned a hard lesson last week that you guys don't like being called worldos. There's a lot of angry tweets, a lot of true hostility towards me for even floating that name. So, point taken. Won't do it again. My guest this week is Robin Wright. She is an incredible reporter for The New Yorker, and we basically did a tour of the hotspots around the globe. We talked about the U.S. relationship with Russia and what Putin wants and why we were letting all these Russian spies in our country to begin with before we expelled them. We also talked about Trump as a negotiator, how he acts versus what a successful negotiation looks like and what that might mean for North Korea. We talked about the situation in Gaza, which is looking increasingly fraught. We talked about Syria, and we also talked a bit about John Bolton, the new National Security Advisor. You will not want to miss this one. I learned a lot in a short period of time, so here is the interview. Robin Wright is a writer for The New Yorker, the author of Rock the Casbah and 7 other books on the Middle East, and a joint fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace and the Woodrow Wilson Center. Robin, thank you so much for doing the show today.
Great to be with you, Tommy.
I want to start with some recent news about Mr. Putin potentially going to Washington. You've been writing a lot about U.S.-Russia relations lately. And this week we learned that during a recent call with Vladimir Putin, Trump didn't just congratulate him on his election victory. He also invited Vladimir Putin to the White House. This would be Putin's first White House visit since 2005, and it comes on the heels of interfering in our elections, voting irregularities, and ballot box stuffing that is all captured on video and brazen, and the attempted murder of a former Russian double agent in London with nerve gas. So it seems like odd timing for a meeting to me, but is there any explanation from the White House about why now or what they want to accomplish in the areas Trump mentioned, which were arms control, North Korea, Syria, and Ukraine?
President Trump has long wanted better relations. He campaigned on that platform, and he has said it many times since his inauguration. There's no question that he wants outreach, and that was reflected in his call immediately after Putin's re-election, suggesting that they have a meeting. The challenge for President Trump is that most of the allies disagree with him profoundly on his approach to the Russians. There is deep skepticism, growing skepticism in Europe about President Putin's intentions. He's been increasingly aggressive during his third term in office, whether it's in Ukraine, seizing Crimea, intervening in Syria's civil war. There are now investigations in Spain about whether Russia tried to influence the vote in Catalonia about independence. And, of course, the Brits are looking at the question of Russian intervention in the Brexit vote. So there is a lot of concern about Russia's tentacles deepening inside the West as far away as a remote cathedral town in Britain called Salisbury.
Yeah. And this also, I mean, like you just said, this comes on the heels of the U.S. literally just booting out 60 Russian spies from the country as part of a coordinated international response to that aforementioned assassination attempts. I bet some people listening are wondering, okay, if we knew there were 60 Russian spies in the U.S., why would we let them in here in the first place? Why do we let them work in Washington or at a consulate in Seattle and give them easy access to Boeing, Microsoft, or a U.S. naval base? Can you sort of explain how these spy agency relations work and how it could be the case that there could be 60 spies in the U.S. to kick out?
The interesting thing is that the Trump administration acknowledged that there are over 100 Russian spies operating in the United States and that they're only kicking out 60 of them and there are still 40 here. That, in some ways, was the most striking fact and little reported. I mean, as you know as well as anyone, there are, even among our allies, there are intelligence agents operating inside embassies. They collect intelligence both overtly and covertly. We often know who they are. There is close scrutiny of their activities by the FBI and U.S. intelligence agencies. But this was a moment that, because of what Russia is doing, there had to be a kind of strong response from the West that I think the Trump administration went along with it. But you also sense the reluctance within the administration to have done it. President Trump said it was likely that Russia was involved in the poisoning of a former double agent in Salisbury, as if he wasn't totally convinced. And again, whether it's in a press conference or some of his public statements, there's a sense, well, he thinks he can get along very well with Vladimir Putin, but maybe it won't happen. And so there's this sense of being torn, that he still wants to try, but that it's difficult right now in the international environment to do what he would prefer to do.
Mm-hmm. Last week, you wrote this fantastic piece for The New Yorker titled, "For Trump, Diplomacy is a Four-Letter Word." And I wanted to raise this piece for a couple of reasons. The first is there is a hilarious story about Trump that I think explains his diplomatic style in a way that I haven't heard done so succinctly before. Second, I also think it speaks to the kind of work and preparation that's actually required for any president to be successful diplomatically, including with, say, North Korea. So could we start with a story? Why did Donald Trump call over to George H.W. Bush's White House and lobby for a job negotiating a nuclear agreement?
Well, in the 1980s, now President Trump, then real estate magnate Donald Trump, was a best-selling author of The Art of the Deal. It had been on the New York Times bestseller list for 48 weeks. And he wanted to prove it was not just real estate he could do a deal, that he could also do a deal on virtually anything. So we lobbied beginning in the mid-'80s and then very hard with the George H.W. Bush administration to be the nuclear negotiator for what became the START talks. And the administration then appointed Richard Burt, ambassador to West Germany, long history of political and military affairs, been at the State Department. And Donald Trump and Richard Burt happened to meet each other at a society wedding in New York. And Trump walked up to him, according to Burt, and said, "So you're the guy," meaning you were the one who got the appointment. And Richard knew the story of Trump's lobbying, and he said, "Yes, I am." And Trump said to him, "Well, let me tell you what I would have done if I'd been appointed the envoy to the Soviets. I would have gotten them into the conference room. I would have made sure they were comfortable, very comfortable. And then I would have stood up and shouted, 'Fuck you,' and walked out of the room." And
sounds about right.
What is so striking about this is that Richard Burt then undertook very complex negotiations with the Soviet Union that played out over 2 years, but had a long history dating back decades in terms of creating principles. What are the ideas that might lead to both superpowers reducing their nuclear arsenals? And so there was an enormous amount that went into this sophisticated background, sense of real knowledge of nuclear arms. And Donald Trump thought that he could do a deal with everyone simply by charming them.
Yeah.
Or bullying them.
And this is why the piece is so great. It's not just that anecdote. I mean, you look back all the way to 1961 when President Kennedy went into a summit with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. And Kennedy thought, like Trump, He could charm Khrushchev. He didn't really prepare adequately, and he failed. And you contrasted that with Nixon and Mao's successful normalization of relations between the U.S. and China, and Reagan's successful negotiation of the START arms control treaty. Why do you think those succeeded where the first failed? And what do you think the lesson is out of those successful experiences for policymakers trying again?
Well, there are two really important encounters. One between John Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev in 1961, when Nikita Khrushchev really wagged his finger at Kennedy and over 2 days of very stressful talks had him wrapped around his little finger. I mean, this was something that Kennedy failed abysmally in charming Khrushchev. And then again, Ronald Reagan meeting with Gorbachev in Iceland, in Reykjavik, in 1986. And he came poorly prepared, but he thought that he could do a deal, that he and Gorbachev saw the world in a similar way. But he stuck to the idea of Star Wars, the Strategic Defense Initiative, and Gorbachev wouldn't go along. So in both instances, they failed. Now, the one time we have done an about-face, we have changed foreign policy dramatically, was when Nixon met with Mao Zedong in the 1970s. And this was particularly interesting because you had, again, a long period of diplomacy in which Henry Kissinger made a secret trip to Beijing. And there was a lot of legwork. The thing that, when you look at the challenges that President Trump faces with North Korea, is that there has been so little time to prepare the legwork. And we're dealing with a regime that has anywhere from 20 to 60 nuclear bombs, has an intercontinental ballistic missile system capable of hitting any city in the United States. This is far more complicated than the Iran nuclear deal. Iran had no nuclear weapons and no intercontinental ballistic missiles. And so the magnitude that we face right now and the lessons of our failure when we thought that an American president could kind of bluff their way through, charm their way through, talk their way through, there are really important lessons about when we failed in the past.
Yeah. And one of the biggest potential negotiations that may or may not happen would be with President Trump and Kim Jong-un of North Korea. You actually visited North Korea with Secretary of State Madeleine Albright in 2000, I believe. Can you talk about that trip and what it taught you about the prospects of achieving some sort of nuclear deal with the North?
Well, North Korea is really a fascinating place, especially as an American going to a country with which we fought a war, and which is in many ways still locked in the mentality of a war in the 1950s. It's a very impressive place in terms of its high rises, but you understand the reality of the difficulties of living there because the light bulbs are so dim. I had to go down to the front desk and ask for something brighter because my computer was the thing that really lit the room. The lights were so dim. And the receptionist said, "Oh, but we've put in our best light bulbs for this secretary's visit." Wow. Walking down the street and seeing carts that were dropping little kernels of rice. And this was, in the aftermath of a terrible drought. And people were going onto the streets, the dirty streets, and picking up these little kernels of rice. That no one would look at me when I walked into the street, through the streets of Pyongyang. I was a foreigner, and who knew what the dangers were of acknowledging a foreigner in this country. But I do think that the North Koreans did want a deal. I think there is almost a desperation to engage with the United States. We've seen this with all three members of the Kim dynasty, Mao in power for 70 years. They wanted that recognition. And it's one of the reasons I think they've developed a nuclear weapon, because they've always feared that the war still officially not over. The end game is still to be fought out.
Did Albright and her people regret making that trip, or do you think it was a worthwhile effort?
Well, I've talked to several of the people who were on that trip in the last few weeks, and this was at the end of the Clinton administration. It was a time when there was a doubt about who had won the election. The administration was trying to decide what would be its last grand gesture. Was it going to be a deal on North Korea's missiles, or was it going to be an Arab-Israeli peace plan? And they could only do one of them. And the administration opted to hold a summit at Camp David between Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat, hoping that they could finally finish the deal that had been started in the 70s between Egypt and Israel. And of course, that failed, and the Clinton administration ended up with neither. One thing that's important to understand about North Korea is that all of the attempts by both Democratic and Republican administrations were based on a broad set of principles, that it's quite easy to determine, look, we want to end the war, we want to see North Korea denuclearized, we want some kind of peaceful coexistence, trade to increase between the two Koreas, a dialogue to be fostered. And whether it was the six-party talks during the Bush administration or the framework agreement during the Clinton administration, the trick was taking these broad principles in both cases, and when you sat down at the table, getting to the specifics of, well, exactly what does denuclearization actually mean? Does it mean getting rid of all your weapons or freezing your program? That there are really different interpretations, and that's where negotiations have always broken down.
Pod Save the World is brought to you by Blue Apron.
Blue Apron.
Blue Apron is offering our listeners $30 off your first delivery. When it comes to dinner, let Blue Apron take care of the planning and shopping while you do the cooking and the eating. You'll enjoy delicious meals like popcorn chicken and sweet chili cabbage slaw and cumin spiced wonton noodles and vegetables and peanuts. It's like they try to give us the hardest ones to say possible. It's a tongue twister.
Yeah, I know. Who could ever get through noodles?
They'll be on the table in 30 minutes or less with incredible ingredients and chef-designed recipes. Blue Apron lets you see what the power of food can do. They deliver fresh, pre-portioned ingredients and step-by-step recipes right to your door. They can be cooked in under 45 minutes. The menu changes every week based on what's in season, is designed by their culinary team. Here's what they do. They give you 12 recipes each week that you can choose from. You pick 2, 3, or 4 based on what best fits your schedule. And Blue Apron only sends non-GMO ingredients and meat with no added hormones. I'd say Hannah and I made Blue Apron last night. We had some steak. We had some mashed potatoes.
Tommy, it says here must endorse.
I'm endorsing the hell out of it right now. We made a delicious meal last night. We made like 3 of them last week. And I'll tell you, when we were making the mashed potatoes, the top of the pepper came off. So we put the pepper on and we just dumped it full of peppercorns, but we ate it anyway because we're animals and we were starving.
Huh.
It was really good, though.
Maybe you got pranked.
Oh, was it that punk show?
Maybe you got pranked.
Ashton Kutcher. Check out this week's menu. You get $30 off at blueapron.com/crookedworld. That's blueapron.com/crookedworld for $30 off. Blue Apron is a better way to...
It's a better way to cook.
Pod Save the World is also brought to you by Stamps.com. These days, you can get practically everything on demand, like this fantastic podcast. Whatever you want it, you get it when it's convenient for you. So why are you still going to the post office to mail letters and packages when you can get postage on demand with Stamps.com? It's so disappointing that you don't get that. Stamps.com, you can access all the amazing services of the post office right from your desk 24/7 when it's convenient for you. Buy and print official U.S. postage for any letter, any package using your computer and printer. And the mail carrier just picks it up. Just click, print, mail, and you're done. It couldn't be easier. We use
Endorsement / personal recommendation required, Tommy.
We use it here all the time. Why
do.
on earth would we go to the post office when we can just send all the stuff we need to send from our office? T-shirts, merch.
When a friend of mine has a baby, there's a whole set of events that then transpire, which is a friend of the pod onesie is sent via Stamps.com to that baby as soon as humanly possible.
If you're friends with Jon Lovett and you just had a baby and you didn't receive a onesie, please tweet at us so we can fact check him in real time.
I'm almost certain that I've hit all the babies with onesies. Calm down.
Out of context. Right now, use Crooked World for this special offer. It includes up to $55 in free postage, a digital scale, and a 4-week trial.
Josephine just got a onesie.
Don't wait. Go to Stamps.com. Before you do anything else, click on the radio microphone at the top of the homepage and type in Crooked World. That's Stamps.com. Click on the little radio microphone and enter Crooked World.
We use Stamps.com to turn babies into advertisements.
Switching gears a little bit, you wrote a fascinating piece, I thought, about deepening ties between Russia and Iran and what that could mean for the broader Middle East. Putin recently visited Tehran to meet with President Rouhani and the Supreme Leader. Iranian media reported that the Supreme Leader specifically said their cooperation would, quote, isolate America. Some analysts say that if the U.S. pulls out of the Iran deal, that could be a tipping point of improving relations between the Russians and Iran and other parties in the Middle East. Can you talk about that piece for a bit and what you think the possible ramifications are?
Well, Russia and Iran are long-standing rivals. Remember, the origin of the Cold War was when Stalin refused to remove his troops from northern Iran after World War II, and Harry Truman issued an ultimatum to Stalin to leave, and he refused, and so it went to the new Security Council, and that really what seeded the Cold War. The Soviet intervention in Iran has alienated a lot of Iranians, and Iranians are deeply suspect of what the Russians want. And of course, during the Soviet era, Iran is an Islamic republic and the Soviet Union as an atheist, officially atheist state. Again, different interpretations of what man's law or what law should be enforced, different understandings of what the obligation to the citizen was, that they differed in many, many different ways. But the interesting thing that's happened in the last couple of years is that a relationship that had evolved into something that was cold and kind of calculating diplomatically or practical economically, or when it came to strategy in the region, kind of tactical, has evolved into something far more meaningful. And this has been pushed a little bit by the Trump administration's targeting of Iran, trying to walk away from the Iran nuclear deal. And now this is increasingly becoming a strategic partnership. And you see this playing out particularly since 2015 in Syria. But it plays out, I think, across the region. And so when Putin went to Iran in November and went straight to see the supreme leader, that was a signal of how the longstanding animosity is over. And there is this moment when, whether it's intentional or unintentional, the Iranians and the Russians have common cause on a lot of things.
Unnerving. Watching that closely are folks in Israel. While we patiently wait for Jared Kushner to solve the Middle East peace process, the situation in Gaza is looking really dicey. Israeli troops fired live ammunition last week at Palestinian protesters who were gathered by the Gaza-Israel border and apparently killed more than a dozen people. Do you know, is this Hamas trying to foment violence? Do we think the Israeli forces overreacted? And how combustible is the situation in Gaza right now?
Well, I'm not in Gaza, so I can't tell you what the intentions of Hamas or the Israelis might be. But I can tell you it is very combustible. And there's a sense that the momentum that was initiated after the Trump administration took office on the peace process has dissipated enormously. And the hope among both the Palestinians and the Israelis that this actually might happen has frayed. And after the president's decision to acknowledge Jerusalem as the capital of a Jewish state and to move the U.S. embassy there in May, that led the Palestinians to walk away. And there hasn't been a meeting between senior officials who used to be quite close between the administration and the PLO office in Washington. And there's a sense that things could get far worse. There's a great fear of a third intifada, that each one has become more militant, harder to control, lasted longer. And there's a danger that if there isn't some kind of progress, some plan put on the table, something to discuss, something to get the two sides together, that events on the ground will overtake diplomacy, which unfortunately is the rule of thumb in the Middle East.
Yeah, I mean, the Intifada, for those listening, is essentially an uprising, right, against the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. I believe the first one was in the late 80s, but each time Hezbollah has stockpiled more rockets and advanced weaponry on the border, and it's become more lethal. And as a consequence, the Israeli response has become longer and more militarized, and the bloodshed was enormous.
You're right. And in many ways, the other border, Israel's other border to the north with Lebanon, is even more volatile.
Yeah.
I went to see Hezbollah. I lived in Lebanon for 5 years. I've talked to Hassan Nasrallah, who's the chief of Hezbollah, and I went to see the number 2 Hezbollah, Naim Qassem, last November. And there's a cockiness among the Hezbollahis now about the amount of weaponry they have. They somewhere between 120,000 and 150,000 missiles pointed at Israel, and they feel that that has given them a deterrent capability. One of the big questions, of course, is do we see, another war between Israel and Hezbollah? We see a little bit of that playing out over Syria now. Israel has carried out something like 200 airstrikes against Hezbollah targets inside Syria, their arms convoys, their military deployments. And that's another combustible situation that, barring some kind of movement on the peace process, could get far worse.
Yeah. I mean, I think American diplomats and politicians have limited capacity to restrain the two parties in this situation in any instance. But, I mean, do you think we have enough credibility today to pull the Israelis and the Palestinians back from the brink, or have we lost that ability?
Well, the Palestinians are not talking to us. The problem with the Palestinians for the last decade, 12 years, in fact, has been that there are two different sets of Palestinians. You have Hamas ruling in the West Bank and the PLO, the Fatah branch of the PLO, ruling in the West Bank, and they have been rivals. They have split officially. There was a reconciliation effort last year, but everything kind of crumbled under the weight of the decision on Jerusalem. And, you know, the problem with the Jerusalem issue is no one ever doubted that Jerusalem would be accepted, embraced as the capital of Israel.
Right.
But it was always an issue of when. Was this a reward at the end of the peace process? And was the Palestinian Authority going to get a small sliver of Jerusalem as its nominal capital? Or, as the Trump administration decided, do you do it up front with nothing in exchange?
Right.
And so it's not the issue of whether Jerusalem is going to be the capital of Israel. The Palestinians understand that. It was the issue of at what point do you do it? And it's one of the pieces of leverage the United States had over Israel. We'll give this to you once you engage in a peace process and the world recognizes the borders of both states.
Pod Save the World is brought to you by ZipRecruiter. Are you hiring?
Yes.
No, because we have one bathroom. Posting your position to job sites and waiting for the right people to see it is a nightmare.
People just have to go before they come to work.
ZipRecruiter knew there was a smarter way, so they built a platform that finds the right job candidates for you. ZipRecruiter's team learns what you're looking for. It identifies people with the right experience and invites them to apply to your job. These invitations have revolutionized how you find your next hire. In fact, 80% of employers who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate through the site in just one day. And ZipRecruiter doesn't stop there. They even spotlight the strongest applications you receive so you never miss a great match.
Now I want to play the song from Les Mis.
The right candidates are out there. I'm racing to finish before he finds it. ZipRecruiter is how you find them. Businesses of all sizes trust ZipRecruiter for their hiring needs. And right now, my listeners can try ZipRecruiter for free. That's right, free. Go to ZipRecruiter.com/pod. That's ZipRecruiter.com/pod. For some reason, the Les Mis theme is on. No one knows why. ZipRecruiter, the smartest way to hire.
Now, I want to apologize to all the gay listeners out there because I did quickly click and it is the 2012 movie, and I apologize.
You mentioned Syria. The other day, Trump offhandedly mentioned that the U.S. would be getting out of Syria very soon. Those were his words. I believe this was news to his national security team, the Pentagon, the press corps, basically everybody. Today, he floated that the Saudis should pay us if we stay in Syria. I think the one thing we've learned about Trump is that when he gets these ideas stuck in his head and he tweets them and he says them over and over again, we should believe him, or we should believe that he sincerely wants to act on these suggestions. So do you have a sense of what our footprint is in Syria at this time and what might happen if we pulled out?
Well, the United States has had hundreds of U.S. special forces in Syria who are acting as trainers and advisors to the Syrian Democratic Forces, which dominated by Kurdish fighters, but includes some Arabs as well. And this was a combination that was critical, pivotal, in beating back ISIS, taking back Raqqa, the nominal capital of the Islamic Caliphate. And so the American presence there has been tremendously important. I was at a conference today with General Votel, who's commander of CENTCOM, and Brett McGurk, who runs the U.S.-led coalition against ISIS. And both of them pointed out that there's still a lot to do, both in Iraq, where ISIS has a nominal presence along the border, but one that could grow. And it still has a big corner of Syria down in the eastern Euphrates Valley. And the United States really needs to stay there to complete the mission militarily, but also then to help stabilize. One of the challenges for the United States is we're great at winning things militarily. Our forces have been phenomenal, whether it was beating the Taliban in Afghanistan, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, beating back ISIS, or helping the Iraqis beat back ISIS, the Syrian Democratic Forces beat back ISIS in Syria. The problem is that we're not very good at creating alternatives, stabilizing environments. That's why we're still in Afghanistan 17 years later, and why we had to go back into Iraq after leaving it after 8 years. So the question now is, what is the priority? What do we need to do to make sure that we don't have to go back to Iraq again or deeper into Syria? So that we kind of finish the job and finish it efficiently, effectively. And I think this is where the big split is between President Trump and many of his national security advisors. Now, that may change once you get a new Secretary of State, CIA Director Mike Pompeo, or a new national security advisor in John Bolton. Both men have been much more similar in their worldview, particularly of the Middle East, than the previous men in their place.
Yeah. I mean, you wrote a fantastic piece about Bolton and how hawkish he is, and really just how out of the mainstream, even of Republican or neocon conservative thought he is. I mean, in fact, by 2008, you had George Bush essentially denouncing his views. Everyone should read that piece, but I wanted to quickly highlight one piece of it that fascinated me. You mentioned that Bolton has long backed a cult-like opposition group called the MEK. They were on the U.S. List of foreign terrorist organizations until about 2012. Now they pay politicians and national security officials of all parties thousands of dollars to speak at their events. They've sort of been normalized in the D.C. swamp world. I bet most people have never heard of the MEK. Can you explain what they are? And is this association troubling to you?
The Mujahideen al-Khalq, or MEK, was one of the groups involved in the revolution. They were on the U.S. list of terrorist organizations because they were responsible for the death of American military officials and diplomats in Iran. And this is a group that is both Islamic and a kind of cult. It's a very strange combination. For many, many years, until the end of his rule, they were supported by Saddam Hussein. They had a big camp on the Iraqi border. They received arms, funding, political support, strategic advice in countering the Iranian government. Now, this is not a group that is popular even among those in Iran who don't like the regime.
Right.
It's been marginalized. In the early days, it was a player, but that quickly faded after it split with the revolutionaries, went its own way, and then became an active opposition group. This is one of the most interesting groups in terms of lobbyists in the United States. It has, as you mentioned, managed, often with a lot of money, to win over people like Louis Freeh, who was the director of the FBI, Tom Ridge, Homeland Security, Patrick Kennedy in Congress, a lot of really big names, Bill Richardson, who was the UN ambassador and Secretary of Energy. There are a lot of people who have flown to Paris, where it's now headquartered, and spoken at their annual conferences. They have tried to buy out others, including Dave Petraeus, the former commander in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, with success in that case, but that it's been very active in lobbying. And Bolton has appeared at their annual conferences, as he bragged last summer, 8 times. And so, yes, I'm concerned in terms of what Bolton might suggest, not just in terms of the op-eds he's written, which he said to get rid of Iran's bomb, you have to bomb Iran, whether it's talking about regime change in North Korea or Iran, which are vastly different than arms negotiations. You're talking about major military operations, expenditure of huge amounts of money with well-armed populations, North Korea with nuclear weapons. This is kind of illusory in terms of what's actually doable. And the big question is, does Bolton want to go one step further than just walking away from the nuclear deal and encourage President Trump to support the MEK as an alternative to the clerics who rule in Tehran? And I don't know the answer to that question, but it's certainly one that I think a lot of people in Washington are watching.
Yeah, I mean, if you took Bolton literally, his writings, you would assume that he wants to use the military to achieve essentially every objective in every hotspot around the world. Regime change in North Korea, regime change in Iran. How literally do you think people who know him well take those words? Or do we think that the realities of the national security advisor position will moderate him at all?
I don't know. I talked to Bolton when he was at the United Nations. Remember, at the time, he was so controversial he couldn't get confirmation from the Senate, so he was a recess appointment. And he was at the UN in 2005 and 2006. And in talking with other Republicans who served with him in the Bush administration, they talk about him being a very good functionary, that he runs a good meeting, that he, as a Yale law graduate, that he understands legalisms. But the question is, how do you marry a very efficient operator when it comes to the government bureaucracy with someone who has very aggressive or ambitious ideas about how to deal with adversaries? And it's hard to tell. I think there are some who think that he may moderate. But remember, the tenor of the administration has changed enormously after 15 months in office. That you had General McMaster, who was a thoughtful voice on foreign policy, who often urged, whether it's compromise or understanding the position of our allies or understanding the limits of U.S. military power and what would be involved in any military operation. And now you have him being replaced by Bolton. Rex Tillerson, who supported the Iran nuclear deal, being replaced by Mike Pompeo, who in Congress called for regime change. And so this is where the dynamics, the agenda, the willingness to step out much further than ever before, I think will be quite visible.
Yeah, not a great trajectory. Robin Wright, I hope that Trump's new national security team has a percentage as good an understanding of these hotspots around the world as you do. Thank you so much for doing the show today and for being with me and for helping us understand a very complicated region.
Thanks, Tommy. Great to be with you.
Thanks again, non-worldos, for listening to Pod Save the World. If you enjoy the show, please tell your friends about it and rate and review us in the iTunes store. It actually makes a difference and helps people discover all this good stuff. Have a great week. Talk to you soon.